Hello, and welcome to PubK's 2023 Government Contracts Annual Review. We're thrilled to have almost 4,000 registrants for this entire program. Over the last 2 days, we've already had 5 different presentation segments. This is our 6th, with 6 more to come over the next 2 afternoons. We hope you'll be able to join us for most, if not all, of the remaining sessions, but a separate registration is required for each session that you want to attend. If you have not already done so, registration is still open on the PubK website under the Annual Review tab. My name is Alan Schwatkin. I'm the president of the PubK Group and a partner in the law firm Nichols Lew. I'll be your host, facilitator, and moderator for this year's annual review. The PubK Group publishes 4 newsletters: PubK Law, PubK Compliance, PubK Cyber, and our newest, launched in mid-2022, PubK M&A. Many of you are already subscribers to one or more of these publications, and we very much appreciate your support. Some of you joining this annual review are not yet subscribers, but I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. Information is at the website shown on this slide or is available from any of the contacts you have at the PubK Group. This conference would not have been possible without the strong support of our event sponsors, all of whom are listed on these next 2 slides. I encourage you to look at the slides and the skills and capabilities these firms have and engage with them where possible. Also new in 2022, PubK joined with Arnold and Porter to launch a periodic podcast called Bonafide Needs, covering emerging issues and interesting interviews. We'll continue that in 2023 as well and encourage you to access them through our website. If you're interested in partnering with PubK on a podcast, we'd be pleased to discuss this opportunity with you. In lieu of speaker gifts and in honor of our sponsors, PubK is making a contribution to the Capital Area Food Bank. With the food crisis facing our communities, including the military, and here in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, I hope you'll also consider making an individual or an organizational contribution. Since the entire program is being held virtually, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. Your video will remain disabled throughout the session, but we welcome your questions. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. However, with so many attendees, it won't be possible to answer all of the questions in real time. We're capturing your questions and will endeavor to answer as many as possible after the conclusion of the annual review. All presentation slides for this program are now available on the PubK website, and all presentation slides along with the audio recording will be available for download from the PubK site probably within a week or so of the conclusion of the full annual review. We'll send an email when this information is available for download, how to access it, and for how long the material will be available. We're also applying for continuing legal education approval in Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and Kansas. Just this morning, we received approval from Florida. And while we cannot guarantee approval from the other states, we expect that acceptance within the next few weeks. Again, we will notify all attendees when those approvals have been received. Finally, if you're interested in obtaining CLA, please look for our poll questions during the presentation. It'll be 1 each hour. State boards require us to verify your participation during the event. We'll keep track of responses to verify that you viewed the panel. If you do not wish to obtain CLA, disregard the poll or just answer for fun. Now I'm thrilled to continue this 8th PubK annual review with our Section 6 panel on cybersecurity and information technology. Our distinguished panel members are our returning veteran, Townsend Bourne of Shepherd Mullen, our first-time participant, Stacy Adeka of Hogan Lovells, and last but not least, we welcome back Kristen Grimes, who's the Associate General Counsel at the U.S. Government's Federal Bureau of Investigation. Townsend, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon to talk about cybersecurity and information technology. We'll start by going over briefly our agenda for the next 2 hours or so. We're going to start with setting the stage, a discussion of recent cyber threats and attacks and some of the legislation coming out of government. We're going to talk specifically about an executive order that actually came out in May of 2021, and we talked a little bit about last year, but we'll cover new developments that happened in 2022 relating to that executive order. We'll talk about controlled unclassified information and the CUI program, which has been in the works now for several years, but there have been some new developments over the past year or so. And then we'll get into proposed cybersecurity regulations and the CMMC program, which DoD has been working on now for several years as well. We'll talk a little bit about the cloud and regulations that are applicable to government contractors and suppliers in this space, both to DoD and to civilian agencies. And then we'll get into a discussion of supply chain risk management, both prohibited sources as well as software and other supply chain issues that the government has been focused on for the past year or so. Next slide.
And to cap our 2-hour presentation, we have an additional 5 topics. Incident reporting. Each of us will be talking about various regimes that have come out addressing incident reporting requirements. Kristen will also be talking about information sharing and, of course, the importance of information sharing in general and in sharing information with the government and collaboration. We'll also be talking about the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, which came out in 2021 and was a brief subject of the last year's presentation, but we'll dive more into detail in that particular initiative. And we'll also be talking about public-private partnerships, their benefits, and also end with some best practices that we can leave you with.
All right. So thanks again to PubK for having me back and inviting the FBI for these kinds of engagements. We always appreciate it. And so given my optic into what's happened in the past year and the trends that we're seeing at the FBI, my panelists, co-panelists have asked me to help set the stage. So what have we seen? A lot in the last year. And unfortunately, malicious cyber actors continue to grow in their sophistication and continue to improve in their cooperation with each other. Cyber criminal syndicates and nation states keep innovating ways to compromise their networks and maximize the reach and impact of their operations. Now, there's no real clear line between where cyber criminals begin and end and nation state actors begin and end. There's a ton of overlap. Some cyber criminals contract or sell their services to nation state actors. Some nation state actors will moonlight as cyber criminals, oftentimes to fund for their own personal gain. And nation states are increasingly using tools that have been traditionally cyber criminal tools, such as ransomware. Our top threat countries, I mean, no big surprises, China, Iran, Russia, but they are becoming more aggressive and they're more capable in the nefarious activities than ever before. We saw a lot of actions in the COVID-19 vaccine and research, compromising the research that we've done in the US, far-reaching disruptive supply chain attacks, and the PRC and others working to obtain control dual-use technology and developing an arsenal of advanced cyber capabilities. And that's in addition to all the economic espionage and other things that these nation states are doing. And so as these adversaries become more sophisticated, and we are increasingly concerned about our ability to combat these threats, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure and particularly during times of crisis. But with all of that said, hopefully that's not too bleak of a picture because we have had a lot of successes too. Now we can't talk about all of them, particularly on the intelligence side, but there have been some very public successes. One of those is taking down the Hydra market. So in April 2022, DOJ announced the seizure of Hydra market, which was the world's largest and longest running dark net market. In 2021, Hydra accounted for an estimated 80% of all dark net market related cryptocurrency transactions. So here on this market, you can buy and sell illicit drugs, buy people's personal information, financial information, use cryptocurrency tumbling services, anything criminal, you name it, you could do it on this market. So market taken down, and in conjunction with that shutdown, DOJ announced criminal charges against an involved Russian. Later, October 2022, DOJ unsealed a federal grand jury indictment, charges against a Ukrainian national for his alleged role in an international cybercrime operation known as Raccoon Info Stealer, which infected millions of computers around the world with malware. This Raccoon Info Stealer was designed as a malware as a service where individuals could lease this malware for about $200 a month and then use it to attack victims, basically through various ruses such as phishing, get the malware on the victim computers, steal personal financial information, and then use that stolen information for further criminal purposes. In conjunction with this unsealed indictment, so obviously the person was arrested by Dutch authorities, but also we did a digital infrastructure takedown with our partners in Italy and the Netherlands. Final success that I'll talk about today is Cyclops Blink, which was announced in April of 2022. And this was another use of court-authorized authorities like we had seen last year. I think I briefly talked about the Hafnium takedown. So in that case, we had court authority to copy and remove malicious web shells from hundreds of computers in the United States that were running on-prem versions of Microsoft Exchange servers. In this case, we had court authority to disrupt a two-tiered global botnet of thousands of infected network hardware devices under control of the Russian GRU. The operation copy and remove malware from vulnerable internet-connected firewall devices used for command and control of the underlying botnet. Next slide, please. So that's at the stage of what we're seeing in terms of cybercriminal activity and nation-state activity. But how does this translate into victims? So we can talk about the impact on victims in terms of victim losses in dollar amounts, number of victims, victim sectors, percentage increase from year to year. This slide is discussing in terms of victim losses. And this is taken largely from our Internet Crime Complaint Center or IC3 reporting. So individuals, organizations can report through IC3. We'll then look at those complaints and action them out to field offices to further investigate. And we also use this as a way to track what cyber crimes are trending. We connect the dots between maybe something that's being reported in New Jersey and California, and there's common tactics, techniques, and procedures, and we can say, that's the same threat actor. Let's really focus our resources there. So it's really important to report through IC3 so we can focus our resources and also try to get budget to allocate resources. So you'll see here the triangle area, which talks about business email compromise, ransomware, elder fraud. These are the usual suspects that continue to be a problem and continue to be on the rise. The red arrow shows things that are on the rise in 2022. Lots of different types of scams, tech support, romance scams, investment scams, corporate data breaches. We're seeing tripling in percentage losses for victims, doubling in percentage losses. It's definitely a problem. The newest trend we're seeing is something called pig butchering, which I'll talk about. Could you go to the next slide, please? So pig butchering is a type of an investment scam, and investment scams as a whole, we've seen 100% loss increase, and over 45,000 of those complaints involve virtual currency. Then pig butchering is kind of the nexus of all of that, which is a type of investment scam that follows a particular typology where it's heavily scripted and contact intensive. The scammer will find victims largely through social media and dating sites and build a lot of trust and rapport, lots of communications going back and forth until the victim has some trust in the scammer. And then the scammer will say, hey, I've got this really great investment opportunity that I'm going to tell you about, just you, maybe just you, you want to invest. The victim invests a lot of money. The scammer will even show websites that purport to demonstrate the investment, the returns on investments, and it all looks extremely authentic. Victims invest, they go later to cash out, there's no money, the scammer's gone, and that's that. So a lot of this is increasing now, although we have had some successes in combating it. Just in November, the Eastern District of Virginia announced a seizure of 7 domain names used in a recent pig butchering scam. Next slide, please. So I just talked about some examples of what we've done, United States government as a whole, but also focused really on the FBI and what we've done to use our unique authorities to impose risk and consequences on malicious cyber actors. Last year, I discussed a lot of these same things with domain and crypto seizures, botnet takedowns, and decrypting ransomware-affected computers. So this year, in 2022 and 2023, moving forward, we're continuing all of this, but more forward-leaning. FBI Director Wray spoke to the Hill in November of 2022, talked about how we're going to continue to use our role as the lead federal agency for threat response to defend networks, attribute malicious activity, sanction bad behavior, and take our fight to the adversaries overseas. And we do this all in conjunction with our partners, both domestic and abroad, to bring cyber criminals and malicious nation states actors to justice. So with that, I'll turn to my co-panelists to further set the stage and explain other government developments in this area.
Thanks, Kristen. Very informative. As you can see, there have been, not only repeat types of attacks, but new types of attacks that companies and individuals are seeing in the space. This increase in attacks, as well as data breaches, not only in the US, but across the globe, has given rise to more activity from the US federal government in the space. Next slide, please. Some sources estimate that at the end of 22, cybercrime overall was going to cost about $6 trillion, and that by the end of 2025, it'll be up to around $10.5 trillion in losses. So again, this is a huge area of concern for companies and individuals worldwide. We've seen widespread cyber attacks that have impacted not only governmental entities, but also private companies and individuals. We talked about some of these last year, but I'll just briefly touch on them again. We saw the SolarWinds digital supply chain attack, which impacted federal agencies as well as private sector companies. We also saw the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which is one of the largest publicly disclosed attacks against critical infrastructure in the US. And then we saw the Apache Log4j vulnerability, which was a software vulnerability that was compromised millions of computers. And in some of the worst cases, allowed China and North Korea to gain access to sensitive information. Finally, we saw Microsoft, which this and other hacks have highlighted the focus on technology supply chains and hackers focusing on companies and entities further down the supply chain in order to get at some of their larger targets. As a result of these attacks, as I mentioned, we've seen more US government initiatives targeting the US supply chain. We've also seen more initiatives to target software and secure software development, which we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. And we've seen particularly new government initiatives in 2022, following on from 2021. Next slide. One of these, the major one that we're going to talk about, is the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, and we'll get into some detail there in the next few slides. DOJ also announced its Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, which uses the False Claims Act to pursue cybersecurity-related fraud by government contractors and grant recipients. And that can come with severe penalties, as most of you know, including treble damages. We're also going to touch on, as we go through today, new regulations that were called for by the executive order and that have come out of other initiatives that are going to require additional measures for protection of sensitive information, as well as additional requirements for cyber threat and cyber incident reporting. We'll take a look at what those look like in a few slides. And then finally, the government's also targeting contractors in this area from the angle of contract compliance and breach. DoD released a memo in June of last year that contemplated different types of penalties, including payment withholdings, terminating contracts, foregoing option periods, potential negative past performance ratings, and suspension and debarment for contractors that fail to comply with cybersecurity provisions. So the government is tackling this from several different angles that we'll talk about today. Next slide.
Great, and thank you, Townsend. I'm going to start talking about giving an overview of Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. As you can see, there were several sections related to several topics. We're going to talk about three of the main topics that have been impacting government contractors today, which include Section 3, Section 2, and Section 4. But you see Section 2 included new sharing threat information requirements. Also, Section 3 includes modernizing federal government cybersecurity, think zero trust architecture. Section 4, which Townsend will be talking about, it relates to enhancing software supply chain security. Then we also have Section 5, which was on cyber safety, the review board. Section 6, the government playbook to respond to cyber vulnerabilities and threats. Section 7, which included the steps for the government to maximize early detection of vulnerabilities and incidents. And then Section 8 included government improvement for its cyber investigation and remediation capabilities. And then you have Section 9, updates to the requirements for national security systems. And if you go to the next slide, we're going to start with a discussion on Section 2, which would ultimately focus on the goal of removing barriers to information technology, operational technology, and cloud service providers to be able to share cyber threat and incident information. And through this section of the executive order, we would hope that service providers could provide and promptly report cyber incident information. And ultimately, this would occur with the streamlining and standardizing of cybersecurity contractual requirements across agencies. And so what we're seeing is that there will be new contractual language. If you go to the next slide, which demonstrates one of the open FAR cases, well, two open FAR cases that are in response to this particular Section 2 concern with removing barriers and sharing information. And you have the first one, which is 2021-019, relating to standardizing cybersecurity requirements for unclassified federal information systems. And then you have the next one, which is 2021-017, cyber threat and incident report and information sharing. That's going to be consolidating some of the service provider reporting provisions, but both of those particular rules, as you can see, the cases were open in 2021, but they are currently now with OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, who is the kind of next stop or central authority for the final review of these proposed rulemakings. And those were sent to OIRA on December 19th, 2022. We expect OIRA to have about a 30-day or 90-day review period. And so we may be seeing something in the next few months or so coming out on these rules. So we'll certainly want to stand by and to see these developments with respect to Section 2. And then next slide, I think goes into Section 4.
Right. Thank you, Stacey. And I think what also is interesting about those Section 2 regulations, we've not yet had a mandatory reporting requirement for cyber threat information. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like for IT and OT providers. So moving on to Section 4, this focuses on enhancing the software supply chain and security of the software supply chain. The executive order section itself is it's pretty long. It calls for various guidance documents and materials to be published by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. One of the first initiatives to come out of this was NIST providing a definition of critical software, which is going to be used by the federal government as they roll out new software security development requirements. And at a high level, critical software is going to be software that allows for privileged access or allows access to particular types of network or security systems. So all of these NIST guidance documents are available on the website if you want to take a look. NIST has a pretty comprehensive section on the executive order. So that first definition came out from NIST, I believe, in 2021. The executive order also required NIST to publish preliminary and updated guidance relating to software development security. Also, minimum elements for an SBOM, a software bill of materials. This has been a hot area of discussion since the executive order came out, because there's been a lot of talk about requiring software developers to provide an SBOM, which would basically be the ingredients list that they use to develop their software. So far, we haven't seen that this is going to be a requirement for all software producers, but it likely will be for some, particularly those that supply critical software. We're also seeing from the executive order, it called for updates to the FAR that would require software providers to attest to compliance with new secure software development practices. We'll talk a little bit more about what that's looked like over the past year later on in the presentation. And importantly, Section 4 also required NIST to develop criteria and guidance for a consumer labeling program for software and Internet of Things devices from a security perspective. So far, that's been rolled out on a voluntary basis. NIST put out some guidance on this, but we're not necessarily expecting regulations or mandatory requirements here. but do be aware that this is an initiative that the government is looking to have consumers be able to identify the security standards of software and Internet of Things devices that they're purchasing. Next slide. This is a timeline taken from NIST's website. So you can see under Section 4 of the executive order, several initiatives were completed in 2021. And I think NIST actually met every deadline on this timeline, which is pretty remarkable if you follow the federal government. So kudos there. But within 2022, there was additional guidance that was published regarding enhancing the security of software development. And that was under Section 4E of the executive order. NIST also put out additional guidelines under 4D of the executive order. So the executive order goes through various initiatives for secure software development and exactly what sort of criteria the software producers should be looking at. So you can check that out on NIST's website if you're interested. And then the final deliverable that was due from NIST in 2022 came out in May, which was a report on the pilot programs for consumer labeling. So that's out as well under Section 4. Next slide.
So obviously there's a lot to this executive order, but I just wanted to highlight zero trust architecture because it really changes our baseline philosophy and the assumptions that we've had operating in the cybersecurity space thus far. We can no longer assume that we can defend against all cyber attacks. And now we need to assume that we are going to fail in some respects. So we need to identify the areas where it's absolutely essential that we don't fail and really focus our resources there. This executive order requires this zero trust architecture strategy, and it's been implemented by the federal government, and it's to be a model for the private sector. So we could also see this particular requirement for zero trust architecture bearing out in future regulation. Next slide.
Great. And that covers the extent of the Biden cybersecurity executive order. We're going to transition now to talk about the CUI program and discuss some updates, and of course, some long-awaited updates that we hope to be seeing this year. But ultimately, the CUI program standardizes the processes for handling sensitive, unclassified information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls. As we know, federal government agencies, they routinely generate, use, handle, share information that might be unclassified, but might be sensitive enough that it does require some level of protection from either unauthorized access or of release. And so historically, each agency has had their own kind of practices for handling sensitive but unclassified information. And so it's resulted in a patchwork of systems across the federal government where information that may be the same might actually be treated differently, or information is the same but is treated differently, or vice versa. And so ultimately, the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, was tasked with running the CUI program, which was an initiative to standardize those practices across the federal government, including across over 100 separate departments and agencies. And so NARA ultimately established the CUI registry, which is a government-wide online repository for federal level guidance regarding CUI policy and practice. And you can go online and find the CUI registry just through Google and access and see the various categories of CUI. And so, of course, there's lots of questions, though. What is CUI? Lots of different categories and types. From a high level, CUI is information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls that are instituted pursuant to law, policy, regulations, or government-wide requirements, but it's not going to be classified information. And so within the CUI registry, there are over 125 total CUI categories within 20 index groupings. And so, for instance, you may have a defense section index grouping and then have subcategories of CUI within that particular index grouping. Of course, notable CUI can include, and federal contractors come across it all the time. If you're working with Department of Defense, controlled technical information. You also can come across export controlled information. If you're working with other agencies, you might even get access to public personally identifiable information or even health information. And all of that types of information are considered CUI and subject to the standard certain dissemination requirements that, as I noted, each agency may have kind of their own system and processes and policies for how to handle. And of course, that bleeds into once you get access to CUI, you're going to be subject to obligations for marking, disseminating, and protecting that particular information. And as I alluded to, different agencies may actually have different policies and procedures for how that information is handled. DoD has led the way, though, in particular in prescribing requirements with respect to CUI through their DFARS clause 252-204-7012, which is the safeguarding and cyber incident reporting clause, where they prescribe the use of adequate security to protect controlled and classified information. And adequate security, as you know, as prescribed in the clause, is related to NIST 800-171. Currently, we're in revision 2. I think revision 3 will be coming out in this next spring. So we expect an update to NIST 800-171 then. But ultimately, that publication outlines the baseline system security requirements for the industry that will be in receipt of controlled and classified information. And of course, it doesn't also just apply to federal contractors as a prime contractor directly, but those requirements also flow down to subcontractors. And so companies also that might create information that CUI, they also would be responsible for protecting and correctly handling that type of information. And we see that certain contracts, there may be times when contractors will actually be creating CUI and will hopefully be working with the federal government on those processes on how to protect it and market and handle that information. Additionally, of course, government does hope that industry will work with the federal government in helping to identify what CUI is. But of course, we know that's not always the case, that the government is aware of what information really is going to be CUI under a particular government contract. So of course, those types of considerations DoD has already been thinking about, but as I noted, there are the civilian agencies that have not instituted or been subject to any specific regulatory requirements through the Federal Acquisition Regulation for also handling CUI. And so as you'll see, there's an open FAR case, which was opened in 2017, related to controlled unclassified information that would implement the CUI program and also provide guidance on breaches for personally identifiable information. And so, of course, the most recent update was as of August 3rd. The FAR and DFAR staffs are resolving open issues identified during the current OIRA review, but we are expecting to see updates to this particular rule and hopefully see something published this year. So similar to those other cyber open FAR cases related to the executive order, we'll also be wanting to stand by to see if we get any updates on the CUI rule. And also just of note too, DHS is in the process of finalizing a rule addressing their treatment of CUI, and it's going to be an update to the Homeland Security acquisition regulations. And that's currently with OIRA getting reviewed also as of late last year. And so we may also see updates to DHS's own CUI requirements. And so, pausing there for a moment, I think we've already talked about at least 4 open pending proposed rulemakings that we'll be expecting to see some activity on, hopefully being published this year. So there will be a lot to pay attention to.
Yeah, and just adding to that discussion, I know there's a lot of, I'll say confusion, but also issues surrounding the marking of CUI. And as you alluded to, what is CUI and how are contractors supposed to identify what that is? I'll just point out that while we're having issues with marking CUI and contractors knowing exactly what it is, we're also starting to see issues with over marking CUI because people, are not understanding really what it is from a narrower perspective. So there can be challenges there if you're receiving something as a contractor that you don't think necessarily qualifies as CUI, particularly if you haven't set yourself up as a contractor that's expected to receive CUI and are not necessarily planning to implement the full NIST requirements. That's something you can push back on and say, you know, we think this may have been over marked here and it may not actually be CUI. So just be aware of both of those issues, I think.
Yeah, those are great points. Certainly pay attention. And we've even seen companies themselves overmark CUI, thinking that everything they're producing in performance of the government contract is CUI, and then flowing that down and creating issues and problems with ensuring that your subcontractors are actually complying. So that's a great point. So next slide. I think we'll be moving on to the cyber regulation and CMMC discussion.
Great. So we wanted to give a little bit of background what current requirements are here, both in the FAR and the DFARS, and then give a couple updates. So this slide relates to a FAR clause for basic safeguarding of federal contract information, which has been in the FAR now for several years. It requires protection of federal contract information, which is a lower level sensitivity of data than controlled unclassified information that Stacy just talked about. Basically, federal contract information is really any non-public information that you're generating or receiving under a federal government contract. I've got the definition up there on the slide, so you can see the full definition there. But the idea here really is the federal government has said contractors and subcontractors, to the extent you are working under a federal government contract, we expect these basic safeguarding requirements for your information systems. The clause itself has 15 different security controls that come out of the NIST 800-171 publication. As some of us know, I think in working with clients, those 15 basic security requirements aren't always all that basic. So you want to make sure to take a look at those. And again, this clause applies to contractors and subcontractors. There is an exception for procurement solely for commercially available off-the-shelf items involving federal contract information. So be aware of that. Also, this clause has no incident reporting requirement. So that's notable when you're looking at the clause here. No real developments that I'm aware of on this one in 2022, but it's good to have the background on federal contract information and the basic safeguarding requirements when we get into the discussion of CMMC. Next slide, please. So within the FAR, we are expecting an update, which would establish a new section relating to cybersecurity supply chain. This will be FAR section 40. It's supposed to be a new section that, according to the proposed open FAR case, would provide contracting officers with a single location in the FAR for these types of requirements. So this is kind of exciting that we're getting an entirely new part of the FAR. The open FAR case number is 2022-10. Currently, the next report on the rule is due January 18th. So we'll see if that date holds. But be aware, we are getting a new FAR part that will relate to cyber supply chain and cybersecurity issues. Next slide. Moving on to the DFARS, Stacy mentioned this clause. It's the DFARS 252-204-7012 clause for safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. This clause has been around for a while now. It requires adequate security for covered contractor information systems, which are contractor information systems that process, store, or transmit covered defense information. So it gets a little confusing with the different terms here, but covered defense information essentially is controlled technical data or CUI under DoD contracts, to simplify it a little bit. Adequate security at a minimum means compliance with the NIST 800-171 security controls. And that publication, as of right now, I guess we're on revision 2, has 110 different security controls for contractors to meet. The clause has a rapid reporting requirement, which states that a contractor should report a cyber incident to DoD within 72 hours of discovery. And it also has requirements for investigating a cyber incident and preserving media for at least 90 days so that DoD can decide whether to come in and conduct a damage assessment. It also has a flow down provision, again, for all subcontracts that involve CDI or operationally critical support. One of the main items to note coming out of last year, and I think Stacy alluded to this, NIST is in the process of updating their CUI publications, starting with the NIST 800-171 document. So the security baseline that this clause relies on is probably going to change. So contractors should be aware of that and following the updates to see how they might need to update security controls moving forward. Next slide. Other DoD regulations that are relatively new require contractors that are subject to the 7012 clause to conduct a NIST 800-171 self-assessment and then report the score that is generated as a result of that self-assessment in the supplier performance risk and assessment system. These clauses also allow for a DoD assessment for the DIBCAC to come in and do a medium or high level assessment of the contractor's information systems. These clauses also are flow downs in subcontracts. So primes are responsible for ensuring that their subcontractors have a current completed assessment. And a current assessment means one that has been conducted in the last 3 years. So interesting tidbit that came out of a cyber town hall that occurred in September of last year. They actually had the DCMA DIBCAC director come in and talk about some of these SPRS scores and self-assessments versus follow-up assessments that DoD came in and did following the self-assessments. He reported that the average score for organizations was about a 66 out of 110, which is about half. And that generally organizations were able to get about 3 points higher when they reassessed themselves and re-reported after a time. He also talked about the fact that when DIBCAC came in and redid an assessment, contractor scores generally went down by 100 points, which is kind of shocking. He said that the average self-reported score was around a 56. And then when DIBCAC came in to do a medium assessment, which is really just kind of looking over the paperwork, it's not even doing a more in-depth assessment, that the score went down to negative 57. So just keep in mind, I think there's still the pretty big disconnect between how contractors are assessing themselves against the requirements and what DoD would like to see with security of contractors. I'll note that the DFARS, the two clauses up on the slide here, the 7019 and the 7020 clauses, they became effective under an interim rule. So we still don't have a final rule there. The open DFARS case says that the next report would be due January 18th. But again, we'll see if that date holds and if we do get a final rule within the early part of this year. Next slide.
Great. And kind of moving on to CMMC, and as Townsend alluded to, there's going to be a lot of updates in this program this coming year. As we know, it was first introduced in January of 2020, CMMC 1.0. And the main goal of this program was to create a unified cybersecurity standard and certification program for companies that were working in the defense industrial base in order to protect federal contract information, which Townsend mentioned, and also CUI. And so as the result of an internal review, on November 4th of 2021, DoD announced a strategic direction for CMMC and announced CMMC 2.0. This would build upon the initial CMMC framework, but was meant to simplify the CMMC standard and provide clarity on cybersecurity requirements, including regulatory policy and contractual requirements. It's also meant to kind of refocus on those most advanced cybersecurity standards and those companies supporting the most sensitive high priority programs through the third-party assessment process. And then also just increase DoD oversight in the assessment ecosystem. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is an image produced by Department of Defense summarizing the new CMMC model 2.0. As you see CMMC 2.0 got rid of the 5 levels involved and moved it down to 3 levels. So you have level 1, which is the foundational level, and that would have been the same as the previous level 1 in CMMC 1.0. And then you have the advanced level, which is level 2, and then level 3, which is the expert level. And they're all progressive levels on top of each other, starting at level 1 up to level 3. And so you'll see in the slide, there's no mention of the CMMC maturity processes or also specific unique CMMC security requirements and practices. So now, if you look on that model column, now each of these levels align with the requirements with the well-known kind of NIST practices that we're all familiar with based on the FAR basic safeguarding clause and also the DFAR safeguarding clause. And so you'll see level 1 notes 15 practices, which again map directly to those 15 practices that Townsend was talking about with FAR 52204-21. You have then level 2, which maps directly to the 110 NIST 800-171 practices. So it aligns directly with that, and you no longer have any unique CMMC requirements. And then level 3, which will also map to the 110 NIST 800-171 requirements. You'll also get a grouping of requirements from 800-172. This particular level is still under development, so we're not certain which those requirements or practices will be. However, they should be coming from 800-172. So if you're familiar with the publication, it should be easier to be able to implement those particular requirements. Also, what you'll see in that assessment column through this image is that you can actually self-assess yourself starting with level 1 and conduct an annual self-assessment and then have annual reaffirmation. So this changed CMMC 2.0 actually eliminated the third-party assessment organization requirement at level 1, where you would have had to have been assessed by a C3 PAO. So ultimately, DoD is now going to require, similar to the self-assessments that you have with NIST 800, 171 through the DFARS clause, the 7020 and 7019 clauses. They're expecting that companies will again register their scores in the supplier performance risk system when they conduct their annual self-assessments and annual reaffirmations with respect to level 1. And you also see a change with level 2 that there is a bifurcation of the level. A subset of level 2 companies that are deemed not to be hosting sensitive information that they believe would not require a third-party assessment, they can still conduct a self-assessment and also have annual reaffirmations, whereas those companies that are working with more sensitive defense information, that they would be subject to a third-party certification. I have heard that DoD has reviewed a lot of those programs that they would believe fall in level 2. And again, these would be those programs where you would be expected to receive controlled unclassified information and kind of map to those the DFAR safeguarding and cyber incident requirements. But ultimately, DoD has said that they expect the majority of those programs that fall in those level 2 to still be subject to a third-party assessment, and that it'll be fairly rare that companies will be allowed to actually conduct their own self-assessment and annual reaffirmations. And these self-assessments will be triennial. So every 3 years, you'll have to get a new assessment from a third-party certifier. And then you can see the last up in the assessment column on level 3, these will be government-led assessments under the particular CMMC level 3. And so these will be similar to those DIBCAC assessments that you have seen in the NIST current assessment requirements and clauses. And so companies at the highest level of sensitivity will expect to continue to see government-led assessments at level 3. And if you move on to the next slide, it just notes a couple other developments within CMMC 2.0 that are some changes from the CMMC 1.0. Ultimately, CMMC 2.0 is now going to allow for a time-bound and enforceable plan of action and milestone, or POAM. And so you can specify a baseline number of requirements that DoD will allow that must be achieved prior to contract award, but then DoD will allow a remaining subset to be addressed in a POAM within a clearly defined timeline. DoD also is planning to specify a small subset of requirements that cannot be in a POAM in support of achieving CMMC certification. So hopefully they'll be putting out a list of those particular requirements that you cannot put in a POAM. And if you find the need that you'll have to, you will likely not get your CMMC certification. And then ultimately, DoD wants to establish a minimum score requirement to support certification with POAMs. And so all three of these will hopefully serve as some baselines and be informative to companies that are seeking CMMC certification, and will help them understand how they can leverage a POAM while they're seeking certification. Also, I don't believe this will happen quite often, but DoD is allowing selective time-bound waiver processes. They're creating those if a waiver is needed and it can be approved. Ultimately, this will have to require senior DoD leadership approval. So that signals that these may likely be fairly rare. And of course, the process will involve having to submit a justification package, also a specific timeline, as these particular waivers will be time bound, and also a mitigation or risk mitigation plan that will be in place as you wait to become CMMC certified as the waiver is in existence. And so we expect a lot more details on this particular process to come out of the rulemaking that we'll be seeing with CMMC, but DoD has indicated that they expect this waiver to apply to the entire CMMC certification and not just a particular cybersecurity practice or safeguarding requirement. And then just noting at the bottom, DoD has posted some resources on its website, the CMMC 2.0 scoping and assessment guides for levels 1 and 2. We're still waiting more information on level 3. Also, the Cyber AB also has a great amount of resources on their website, and they host monthly town halls. So you can hear from their side what they're seeing as developments come along. For instance, we know that the Cyber AB last year put out the Cyber CMMC assessment process, or the CAP, which was subject to a lot of discussion and comments, and we expect that there will be a new CAP issued by the Cyber AB in the first quarter of this year, so be on the lookout for that. But the Cyber AB's website is also just a great place for resources to get up to speed and kind of keep abreast of any of the developments relating to CMMC. And then if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the rulemaking that we'll be expecting with respect to CMMC. And we know that in September of 2020, DoD had created a new DFARS clause 252.204-7021. And this was a result of that interim rule that also issued those new NIST assessment provisions. That clause was going to be part of a 5-year piloting program where this clause would be put in solicitations and also contracts, and then ramp up so that this clause would appear in all DoD contracts by 2026. As we saw in November 2021 with the introduction of new CMMC 2.0, that the advance notice actually suspended that CMMC piloting effort, and so we will see new changes to CMMC. None of the changes that DoD has talked about, including in the notice of advanced proposed rulemaking, that they will not become mandatory until the final rulemaking process is complete and those new requirements are implemented. DoD indicated that it's going to be updating Title 32 to establish the CMMC 2.0 program, and also may make amendments to Title 48 if they need to make changes to the CMMC program content itself. And so we currently have open DFARS case 2019 D041, which is going to be implementing CMMC. And again, as it states by the rule, will be measuring the company's maturity and institutionalization of cybersecurity practices and processes. So this will be the rule that will ultimately formalize the CMMC program and impose their requirements on government contractors. As of January 6th, from the open DFARS case update, the drafting of the rule is underway, and there's a report due on January 11th. of this year. We're not sure if that date will actually stick, or as we've seen in other rules passed, the date keeps getting pushed back. And as we know from DoD, we heard that they were expecting March for a publication of a rule. That got pushed to May last year, end of last year, and now we're thinking we might not see a rule until at least summer. And there are questions about whether or not the rule will be an interim final rule or if it will be a proposed rule. We hope, given the extent of the content involved, the importance of this program, that it will be issued as a proposed rule, but we have seen at DoD, they do leverage the interim rules quite often, even when we saw it on the 7012 clause. So time will tell. So we'll want to, stand by to see what develops with this particular rulemaking, but we do expect something to at least be issued this year. So another rule to look out for and developments to look out for in this coming year. And so next slide.
Now we'll start with a discussion of cloud issues in the space. So FedRAMP, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, is a program that was established in order to help the government remove barriers to the adoption of cloud technology, and in particular, commercial cloud technology. Several years ago now, I guess over 10 years ago now, this program was rolled out, and really agencies had identified security as the major barrier for them adopting some of these commercial cloud solutions. So the FedRAMP program was instituted under GSA. The Program Management Office came out with several different guidance documents and a program whereby cloud service offerings would be assessed by a third-party assessor, a 3PAO. So as Stacey mentioned, under the CMMC program, now that similar model would be used for the level 2 and the level 3 assessments by third parties, which are being called C3PAOs. So under FedRAMP, these third-party organizations will work with a cloud service provider to put together the required security documentation, perform an assessment, and then those cloud products and services that are FedRAMP authorized are listed on FedRAMP's public marketplace online. So you can go on and look at a list of the FedRAMP offerings that have been either authorized or that are in the FedRAMP ready state, so that they're getting ready to be FedRAMP authorized. The program also includes continuous monitoring and incident response rules for cloud service providers that are authorized. Generally, cloud providers will work with an agency when they're getting their authorization, so that that agency provides them with an ATO or an authority to operate the cloud service product or service with that agency. There's also another pipeline to receive FedRAMP authorization through a joint authorization board, which certifies about 6 cloud offerings a year. So this program has been in place for a while, but the major update that recently happened is that within the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, FedRAMP was actually codified into law through the FedRAMP Authorization Act, which was section 5921 of the 2023 NDAA. So this section of the NDAA codified FedRAMP. It also established a Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee, which is tasked with identifying areas of improvement and facilitating communication between FedRAMP stakeholders, so between federal government agencies, commercial cloud service providers, and the third-party assessors, to make the process more efficient and to streamline some of the activities. One of the major complaints about this program has been the time that it takes both to engage with an agency and to actually get through the authorization process. So there have been efforts to streamline and improve efficiencies within that process. The FedRAMP Authorization Act also establishes a FedRAMP board, which is going to be made up of senior officials from various agencies and DoD. That board is responsible for coming up with best practices and also establishing and updating requirements for authorization consistent with NIST. So 2 new organizational bodies, the board and the committee, established. Another big takeaway from this FedRAMP Authorization Act is the presumption of adequacy, which was written into the law. Previously, federal cloud solutions could be authorized through FedRAMP, and then individual agencies would do their own security assessment before using that cloud product. Now with this act, there's a presumption of adequacy that a FedRAMP authorized cloud product or service is adequate for agency use without need for an extensive separate review by that agency. So again, this is meant to establish the legitimacy of the FedRAMP authorization and the program, and to streamline some of those security reviews that had been happening previously. Next slide. Under the DFARS, there are particular requirements for cloud computing providers to DoD. You'll note here we have the DFARS clause relating to cloud computing services, DFARS 252, 239, 7010. Note there is no analogous provision in the FAR for cloud computing, so that's civilian agencies really have relied on the FedRAMP program there. DoD has its own provision so that cloud providers that house information on behalf of DoD are required to comply with DoD's security requirements guide, which is a particular, very long document, but also publicly available if you want to take a look, document that has requirements for the various impact levels that cloud service providers can be authorized to. And those impact levels align with the sensitivity of the data and the type of data that's going to be hosted within them. The clause itself requires compliance with the SRG, but it also includes requirements for cyber incident reporting, investigation, data preservation, and submission of malware to DoD. Those requirements are similar to those that we see in the 7012 clause that we already talked about for cyber incident response, but they vary a little bit for cloud providers. This clause is also significant because it includes a requirement that all DoD government data must be held within the US unless there's written authorization for it to be in another location. So working with DoD, cloud providers are required to maintain that government data within the United States. An update on this last year is that DISA actually put out an update of the security requirements guide, and that happened back in January of 2022. But this was the first major revision to that guide since 2017. So pretty big deal there for cloud providers that, we hadn't really seen an update here at all. And another thing to think about too, with the FedRAMP Authorization Act, there's going to be collaboration there with DoD. So we may see some more streamlining between how DoD approaches cloud and also how FedRAMP approaches cloud. Next slide. Another key point in the space within the DFARS 7012 clause, which we already have discussed, there is a provision for contractors that use external cloud service providers. So it gets a little complicated sometimes, but basically as a contractor, if you then use a cloud service provider as part of your contract performance, you're not necessarily the cloud provider yourself, but you use an external cloud service provider, you're required to ensure that that external cloud service provider is either approved at the FedRAMP moderate baseline, so has that FedRAMP authorization, or the clause says can have equivalent security requirements. So that's something that a contractor or a subcontractor would need to make sure is in place under the DFARS 7012 clause. It also says that the contractor should require an external cloud service provider to comply with requirements for cyber incident response and reporting. And this is interesting, and I think we're going to see more clauses like this potentially in the proposed open FAR and DFARS cases we've been talking about today, because the clause specifically, and DoD has said, it's not necessarily going to flow down to your external cloud service providers, because as the contractor, you may not consider them a traditional subcontractor. So you may not be flowing FAR and DFARS clauses down to them. But this clause imposes a specific requirement that you ensure that those external cloud service providers are complying with cybersecurity requirements and cyber incident response requirements. So this is a way that we've seen the government in the past try to get at those IT, OT, and ICT service providers that aren't necessarily traditional subcontractors. And we're likely to see that, I think, in some of the proposed rules that we're going to see this year. Again, I'll just note the 7012 clause, it actually kind of spells all of this out for you. So when it talks about adequate security, as we've already discussed, it says contractor information systems should be compliant with NIST 800-171. External cloud service providers should be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. And then it kicks you over to the DFARS 7010 clause if you're a cloud service provider, and that requires compliance with the SRG. So kind of various levels here for adequate security and when certain baselines apply. Next slide.
And I'm going to jump in just for real quickly here and run our first poll. If you're interested in CLEs, please respond to the poll. We'll leave this up for 2 minutes and give you a chance to respond. Thank you. And I'll turn the time back over to you, Johnson. You can go ahead.
Okay, moving on to supply chain risk management. Section 889 was part of the 2019 NDAA, and I think we covered that pretty exhaustively last year. So I've got a couple slides on it this year with a few updates. So this is the section, it's been called the Huawei ban. It requires that contractors do not provide or use covered telecommunications equipment or services. And it defines covered equipment or services as we have on the slide. It specifically names Huawei and ZTE. It also includes a handful of other Chinese tech companies and their subsidiaries and affiliates, which has been an area of concern because that can be a long list and that list is constantly changing. It also allows for the government, particularly the Secretary of Defense, in consultation with some other individuals, to name other entities that would be covered under this provision. We haven't seen that officially yet, but it is built into the section. This was rolled into several FAR clauses since Section 889 came out, and those clauses are applicable to all contractors. It was very clear that there was to be no exception here for COTS providers or for purchases under the simplified acquisition threshold or for small businesses. So this is a big one. When it came out, it required all contractors to basically try to identify and purge this stuff from their supply chains. And it required that prime contractors conduct a reasonable review in order to remove this from use company-wide. Next slide. So this came out under two different FAR cases. So when we talk about Section 889, generally we talk about Part A and Part B. Part A is what we've been calling the supply chain prohibition, which prohibits contractors and subcontractors from selling up to the federal government covered equipment or services, as described on the previous slide. There is a representation provision within the FAR at FAR 52-204-24 that requires contractors to represent, and now there's a SAM representation that can be completed, stating whether or not the contractor does or does not supply these covered products or services up to the federal government under Part A. The Part A section and Part B now also include a reporting requirement if any of this is discovered during contract performance, that the contractor report within 1 business day and then provide a follow-up report with additional information once they have it, if they discover use of this information during contract performance. So that's Part A. That came out under FAR case 2018-017. Then the following year, we got Part B through the FAR and FAR case 2019-009. And this is the broader use provision that really kind of sent waves throughout the government contracts community, I think. It prohibited contractors from using any of the covered telecom products or services throughout the contracting entity. So regardless of whether or not that use was necessarily tied to federal business. So Section 889 Part B was rolled into the FAR, and in FAR Part 52-204-25. Both of these clauses came out under an interim rule, and as Stacey mentioned before, this is one of those instances where the government put out an interim rule that became effective very quickly. So these are live requirements, although we don't yet have a final rule. As I mentioned before, a lot of comments went in on these rules, including, how do we identify all the subsidiary and affiliate entities that we're supposed to be capturing here? What is a reasonable inquiry under Part B for us to look through our entire entity to determine if we use any of the covered products or services, and additional issues there. So these FAR cases are still on the open FAR report. And according to that report, the next deliverable is due tomorrow, which these have been pushed out now multiple times. So I'd be surprised if we actually see something tomorrow. Next slide. Another new initiative, and I think people have been hearing a lot about this, semiconductors and how the federal government is working to put restrictions in place so that we are not so reliant on Chinese technology and semiconductors that are being produced outside the United States. This was addressed in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that was just passed, and that was addressed in Section 5949. The provision has two parts, and I put it right after Section 889 because in the initial drafting, this looked a lot like Section 889. It still does a little bit, but it's morphed throughout the drafting process. So I've got there Parts A and Part B, which are both prohibitions on the government procuring electronic parts, products, or services that include covered semiconductors, or a little bit further removed, I think, down the supply chain, there's a prohibition on procuring electronic parts or products that use electronic parts or products that include covered semiconductor products. So it gets a little, tangential there, but those are the two main provisions of Section 5949. It defines covered semiconductor products or services, as we have there on the slide, naming 3 specific Chinese semiconductor companies. Note there, it also includes their subsidiaries or affiliates, as we saw with Section 889, so similar issue there. And it also allows for the Secretary of Defense, in consultation with other individuals, to name other entities that may fall under this provision. Next slide. Notable here, Section 5949 does not include that broad use within the company prohibition like we saw with Section 889 Part B. This was something that companies pushed back on pretty hard in the drafting. Again, it was difficult for companies to do Section 889 Part B. This, I think, some thought would have been practically impossible. There's a lot of difficulty in identifying these semiconductors within products or services that are existing. There is a bit of leeway here for compliance. The effective date is going to be within 5 years. So we've got a little bit of a runway there for effectiveness. The section contemplates FAR regulations to come out within 3 years. And we expect those FAR regulations in some ways would mirror the Section 889 requirements for representation and for some sort of reasonable review here. Notably, the section itself actually does build in some protections for contractors. It specifically says that contractors can reasonably rely on certifications that they get from suppliers, which is helpful in the Section 889 context. I know we've talked to clients about how best to ensure that suppliers are compliant. Do you need a certification? Do you just float on the clause? What's the best way to make sure that you are, complying, but maybe not going overboard? So that's something to consider here as well. And it also says that contractors will not be subject to civil liability or will not be found to be non-responsible when they provide a notification to the government that they've discovered some of this covered semiconductor technology. And within that provision, it does contemplate that manufacturers should have a comprehensive and documentable effort to identify and remove these covered semiconductors from their products and services within the federal supply chain. And those regulations, again, would come out within 3 years, but I think it's notable that there is some protection built in there for contractors, realizing the difficulty that we've had with Section 889, I think. Next slide. So getting into the software supply chain security issue in a little more detail, we talked earlier about Section 4 of the executive order, which spelled out additional guidance documents and initiatives from NIST, and also contemplated a FAR clause for software producers to attest compliance with secure software development practices. We saw in September, OMB issued a memo on this topic. It came out on September 14th. And basically, this memo was addressed to agencies, telling federal agencies that they needed to ensure that their software suppliers comply with NIST's Secure Software Development Framework, or the SSDF, which is at NIST Special Publication 800-218, and also attest compliance with NIST's Software Supply Chain Guidance, which are some of the materials that came out under the executive order. So this walks through several different agency initiatives. There are some definitions here and timelines. If we go on to the next slide. The OMB memo uses a definition of software that NIST provided, and it's actually quite broad. It includes firmware, operating systems, applications, cloud-based software, and other types of software. So if we really think about this, it is quite broad, including products that incorporate software and cloud-based apps. According to the memo, software producers would need to provide a self-attestation of compliance, or they could have a third-party assessment by a 3PAO, so one of those authorized third-party assessors under the FedRAMP program. The memo also contemplates that agencies could require software producers to provide a software bill of materials or other evidence of participation in a vulnerability disclosure program, or potentially other artifacts to demonstrate in more detail their secure software development practices. It's likely these are going to be required for critical software, but the memo leaves it a little bit open for agencies to determine when some of these additional artifacts might be required. Under the memo, there are various timelines, key dates that are applicable to contractors and software producers is within 90 days of September, which I think would have already passed in this month or is coming up soon, that agencies are to inventory all of their software to be able to identify what they consider critical software versus non-critical software so that they can begin to understand from which providers they're going to need to start collecting these attestations. Per the OMB memo, within 270 days, which would be by June of 2023, agencies are supposed to be collecting attestation letters from software producers for critical software. So again, this goes back to the NIST definition that came out in 2021 and is now being applied here for agencies to identify critical software and then get those attestations from software producers. The memo then says within 365 days or within a year, so September of 2023, agencies should be collecting attestation letters for other software, so the non-critical software. So it actually spells out a little bit more, if you're a software producer, this would be applicable to any new major revisions or new software that comes out after September of last year. It also contemplates a new FAR rule for a standard attestation form to be used by software producers when providing these attestations. So I think we're still waiting for a little bit more guidance here. But it is, going to be a big area if you're a producer of software, or I think even if you sell software to the government, that you're going to need to keep an eye on this. There is another open FAR case. I know we've thrown a lot at you today, but it's FAR case 2023-002 on supply chain software security. And that open FAR case is supposed to implement Section 4N of the executive order that we talked about earlier, requiring suppliers of software available for purchase by agencies to comply with and attest to complying with the secure software development requirements. As of, I think we last looked at this on January 6th, the next due date is January 25th of this year. So a lot of dates in January now to keep track of, but possibly continuing to push out. So this is another big area in supply chain to keep on your radar, and we'll be on the lookout for more guidance here as well. Next slide.
Okay, so continuing the theme of supply chain risk management, this slide discusses the Federal Acquisition Security Council, or the FASC. So the creation is older news. It was formed in the Secure Technology Act of 2018. And it requires the Federal Acquisition Security Council creation, chaired by the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and it's tasked with evaluating supply chain risk to the United States government IT systems. This was created essentially to fill in the gaps left by other executive branch committees and councils, such as CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, Team Telecom. These all have very specific mandates with particular jurisdiction based on the national security threats when they fall into discrete categories. This FASC is a whole of government approach that applies to the IC, military, and civilian agencies. And what it does is it allows for removal or exclusion of certain sources or articles from federal systems, or exclusion from future procurements. And this can be done at the recommendation of the directors of Defense or Secretaries of Homeland Security and Defense, and also the Director of National Intelligence. They can issue orders consistent with recommendations given to them, and then the FASC provides notice to affected companies of the recommendations. The FASC is also authorized to share supply chain risk information across the USG enterprise and with the private sector. The FASC promulgated its final rule in August of 2021 and has developed all the requisite processes to begin considering covered sources and articles for removal or exclusion. Next slide, please. So if the FASC is looking inward at the US government, this is basically everything else. Executive Order 13873, which is securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, was signed in May of 2019. So again, older news in terms of its enactment, but its continuing moves toward action. And it authorizes the Secretary of Commerce to review and prohibit transactions or classes of transactions involving foreign persons that is owned, controlled, or subject to the influence or direction of a foreign adversary, providing ICTS to a US person, where the provision of such ICTS creates an unacceptable or undue risk to the national security of the United States. Commerce promulgated the interim final rule in January of 2021, which designates 6 countries listed on the slide to include the PRC and Russia as foreign adversaries. And this list can be modified as needed. And it also provides the broad list of ICTS that are within the scope of Commerce's review. In March of 2021, the Secretary of Commerce had a public press release that talked about subpoenas they had served on multiple Chinese companies that provide ICTS in the United States. The subpoenas were issued to gather additional information to help Commerce in their investigation to determine whether or not those transactions meet the criteria under the executive order. Further, in June of 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14034, which expanded upon 13873 to include companies responsible for the development and applications or software used to covertly collect personal and proprietary business information of American citizens. These processes continue to mature, so it's definitely worth keeping an eye on what comes of implementation here. Next slide.
And one final item relating to supply chain risk management we want to flag is DoD's February 2022 report on securing defense critical supply chains. This report also ultimately provided DoD's current analysis of the defense industrial base supply chain challenges and included recommendations for strengthening and enhancing the resiliency of the supply chain. And it identified specific strategic enablers necessary to build those overall supply chain resilience, such as cyber posture. And there was an emphasis in this report on cybersecurity, supply chain risk management, that really should be an overarching priority. And the report references, of course, NIST Special Publication 800-161 relating to cybersecurity supply chain risk management. And in referencing these particular items, the report recommends that DoD should develop its own cybersecurity supply chain risk management best practices guide in line with NIST 800-161. And we have seen over the last year or so, NIST 800-161 actually be subject to some revisions. And that was in line with Biden's cybersecurity executive order. So that has been a publication that has also been subject to change over the last year or so. And of course, predictably, the report also emphasizes the importance of cybersecurity assessments and information sharing. And we've talked a lot about those initiatives already, but it is worth noting, and in line with our theme of all the open FAR and DFARS cases, there is another DFARS rule contemplated that will expand the classified incident reporting program that DoD runs to also include those companies that are working with CUI. At last I looked, it looks like there may be a notice of proposed rulemaking issued in May of this year. So we'll also want to keep our eyes out for that particular development.
And I think one more area in the issue of supply chain risk that we don't have a particular slide on anymore, but it's Internet of Things devices, which we touched on a little bit under the executive order. It did contemplate NIST developing criteria for the consumer labeling program relating to software as well as Internet of Things devices. Right now, there's no contemplated regulation or requirement relating to IoT devices that are provided to the federal government. However, NIST has a variety of guidance materials on its website that relate to Internet of Things, both to the producers and also to the acquisition of those devices. So keep that in mind. That's something we're following. There have been several initiatives to legislate in that area. Can be a key vulnerability area. Obviously, if you've got an IoT device that can listen to you, then somebody that you don't want to be listening could potentially be listening. So another area that the federal government hasn't really focused on yet in terms of requirements, but another area of supply chain risk to keep in mind.
Yes, stay tuned until next year.
Exactly. Next slide, please.
All right, incident reporting. It's always fun. So we have heard, and I'm sure you've heard from your clients, that there is a strong desire for more federal coherence to report incidents. CIRCIA, or the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022, is one step in that direction. CIRCIA will require covered entities to report to CISA any covered cyber incident within 72 hours from the time the entity reasonably believes the incident occurred, and will require covered entities to report to CISA within 24 hours of making any ransom payment made as a result of ransomware attack. And you can see just in that alone, there's a lot of terminology that can be subject to many different interpretations. And we've seen that in the DFARS clause and in others, like what is considered a cyber incident? What is reasonably believes? There's a lot of questions. And so CISA issued an RFI to get comments from the private sector, from anybody about how they believe this regulation should be implemented. And I believe that comment period closed in November of 2022. And CISA received over 120 sets of comments, I'm sure, from many people in the audience right now to discuss, how these regulations should be implemented. And you can see those comments if you're interested. They're available at regulations.gov. There should be a notice of proposed rulemaking no later than March 2024, but it could be sooner. And the final rule is expected by September of 2025. I'll note covered entity here is defined in the Presidential Policy Directive 21, which is an entity in the critical infrastructure sector. Now, there will be a technical solution here. So if an entity reports to CISA, there will be a portal that should immediately send those reports out to other agencies as well for immediate sharing. But that technical solution is still years out. So from FBI's perspective, CIRCIA does not prevent anybody from co-reporting to FBI as well, if that's something you want, because we can be at your doorstep within an hour to help you with an incident. So we're a resource for you if you want to also continue reporting to us. Next slide, please.
So turning back to the DFARS, we wanted to just focus briefly on the incident reporting requirement here. We mentioned this earlier, but this clause does include a rapid reporting requirement, which is defined as within 72 hours of discovery of a cyber incident. As Kristen mentioned, there's a bit of non-consensus here on when do you actually discover a cyber incident and what is a cyber incident. We've got the definition there. It's incredibly broad. If you read it literally, it includes potential compromises and includes language that's meant to get, I think, at as broad of a situation as possible. But I do know that there's some interpretation of when do you actually discover an incident. Is it right when you know something is potentially wrong? Is it when you have a little bit more information? Is it after you've conducted more of an investigation on your end? So there's a little bit of non-agreement there. The clause itself has particular requirements upon discovery of a cyber incident, in addition to reporting. a contractor is required to investigate the incident and preserve media. The review required within the clause is of compromised computers and servers, data, user accounts, and other information systems that may have been impacted. So this clause does, when you read it, it actually requires an extensive investigation by the contractor once a cyber incident has occurred. It also requires that a contractor submit malicious software to DoD through a specific portal and preserve affected media for at least 90 days to allow DoD to come in and perform a damage assessment if it chooses to do that. The DIB portal is how contractors and subcontractors are supposed to report cyber incidents, and we've got the link there. In order to report, it requires you to have a medium assurance certificate, and that has to be obtained in advance. So if you don't have that or don't think you have that, it's worth checking. This is also, and it's not as clear from the regulations, this is also where you would report a Section 889 issue as well. So having that medium assurance certificate in place is helpful. Also, we'll get into this a little bit later, but DoD organizations can voluntarily report cyber threats and incidents through this portal. So it wouldn't be a mandatory report under the 7012 clause. It could be a voluntary report. For example, if a company has a phishing attack or a business email compromise that doesn't necessarily involve covered defense information, a DIB company could voluntarily report that through the portal as well. GAO put out a report in November of last year that actually went back and reviewed DoD cybersecurity. It looked pretty hard at the DoD itself, but also at contractor compliance with the 7012 reporting requirement. So this GAO report on DoD cybersecurity is entitled Enhanced Attention Needed to Ensure Cyber Incidents Are Appropriately Reported and Shared. So this GAO report actually found that DoD had not fully established and implemented robust processes to report and share cyber incident information that impacts the DIB. So that's looking at the DoD itself. It also found that mandatory cyber incident reports, so those coming in through contractors and subcontractors, were generally incomplete and submitted outside of the 72-hour mandatory reporting window. It also found that over 50% of the reported incidents were submitted more than 4 days after discovery. So again, that data discovery maybe is up for some interpretation, but according to this GAO report, in about half of the instances, reports were more than 4 days after discovery. GAO recommended in the report that DoD encourage more complete and timely mandatory cyber incident reporting from the DIB and make sure that contractors understand the requirement there so that they are providing timely reports. Next slide.
And we'll end our incident reporting section discussing the new SEC rule that was published in March of last year. SEC ultimately proposed amendments that would require public companies to report information related to material cybersecurity incidents and would also require companies that are publicly traded to share information about their cybersecurity risk management and also corporate governance. And so the new requirements had the intention of kind of standardizing cybersecurity reporting requirements, but of course, as we've heard today, there are several other reporting requirements, so it just gets layered on top of those that are already in existence. Ultimately, though, SEC proposed to amend its regulations and forms to require companies to report cybersecurity incidents on their Form 8Ks within 4 business days after the company determines that an incident is material. And companies would also be required to report and provide updated disclosures through their 10Qs and 10K forms. And also, if unreported incidents appear to compile and in the aggregate appear to reach a materiality standard, that then they would need to report those in their 10Q and 10K documents also. So needless to say, there'll be lots of potential reporting from public companies as required by this rule. And it's not just incident reporting that you'll see, but as I noted, information related to cyber risk management and governance is also going to be required to be reported by these public companies. And so some of that information could include their policies, a company's policies and procedures for identifying and managing cybersecurity risk. including whether or not they even consider cybersecurity risk as part of their business practices, financial planning, or even collateral or capital allocation considerations. And the annual reporting requirements could also encompass disclosure about the board's oversight of cybersecurity risk, the management's cybersecurity expertise, management's role in assessing and managing cybersecurity risk, and also its role in implementing the company's cybersecurity policies and procedures and strategies. And in addition, the rule also notes that companies may also be obligated to disclose in their Form 10-Ks and in their annual proxy statements whether even a board member has cybersecurity expertise, and describing and including a description of that level of expertise. And so needless to say, there's a lot packed into this rule. We are expecting a final rule to be issued in April of this coming year. 170 comments, though, were received by the SEC in response to this particular proposed rule. So they're likely going to be going through quite a bit of comments. We'll see if they can keep on track with their timing of April of 2023 for a new rule, but you'll want to stand by for this one as well.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, we've talked about the DFARS, the SEC rule. There are many other incident reporting rules that may apply to you outside of the particular government contracting space. So I think FTC has been working on its safeguards rule, FCC, and then of course, state breach notification laws are in play as well. So just keep in mind, there's a whole universe out there of incident reporting and cyber requirements that we may not have touched on today, but that may apply.
And if you're a global company, add a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, add international requirements as well. And I think we're going to break for a brief poll at this time too.
Yes, sir. Please respond to the poll if you're interested in CLEs. We'll leave this up for 2 minutes so the panelists can ignore the little box and they can continue, and we'll let the audience answer to the poll. Thank you.
Great. And I think you can move to the next slide, please.
Privilege. This is definitely a hot issue. In fact, the Supreme Court yesterday heard oral argument in a privileged case it was a tax case, but it's still getting at the same issues as to whether a communication that involves both legal and non-legal advice is protected by attorney-client privilege, and which test should prevail, whether obtaining legal advice was a significant purpose of the communication or the primary purpose. And as most of you know, in cyber incident response cases, there are a lot of overlaps between business advice and legal advice, and being able to distinguish between those is very important in making the privilege determination. And we know that companies are trying to strike the right balance. You have cybersecurity on one hand, and then protecting information and privilege in the anticipation of litigation on the other hand. And we've seen some reluctance to even now create reports in the wake of a breach because of the fear that they might be subject to discovery in litigation. And so we're trying to think of ways that we can strike the right balance and also preserve the cybersecurity ecosystem. Unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty given case law. We had some more favorable decisions related to privilege in 2015 and 2017 with Experian and Target. And then we moved to Premera Blue Cross, Dominion Dental, Capital One, Rudders, and one other one, Clark Hill, where privilege was not upheld. And the courts have declined to give us a bright line rule when it comes to making these determinations, especially when sharing the information with law enforcement. But they do provide a lot of insight into what they may have seen favorably in terms of potentially upholding privilege. And so they offer some tactical steps to protect privilege in the aftermath of a breach. And I'm conveying this today not as legal advice, but as ideas, things you may want to consult when determining your own approach post-breach and also pre-breach as you develop your playbooks and do tabletop exercises to see how these things play out. And some of the options that they discuss are developing a 2-track effort where you have business in one track and legal in the other track, and those tracks do not meet. And that means your reports are separated, your personnel are separated, and your budgets are separated. Potentially engaging a separate incident response firm post-breach, I know there's a lot of reluctance to do this because by having a IR firm on retainer, you have someone who's familiar with your systems and it's easier to respond. But courts have said that having a new firm is more likely to maintain privilege, or if you're retaining the same firm, to create a separate statement of work specific to that breach.
And a new firm engaged by legal, right?
Yeah, and that's another thing, like I said, having legal, your counsel as the intermediary, typically outside counsel if you're in-house, but having outside counsel be the conduit for establishing these things, courts have said to them that they would be more favorable in keeping privilege to be upheld. In terms of sharing information with law enforcement, I highly recommend, if you have not seen this, the Department of Justice Journal of Federal Law and Practice, May 2021, the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section at DOJ, 2 lawyers there wrote an article called Privilege and Data Breach Investigations. And it's really fantastic because it talks about the actual ways that you can share with law enforcement and still be likely to maintain that privilege. And I just want to note here that the information that we're interested in when we come to help in an incident is not the same information that you are probably interested in to determine potential liability and to create to do legal analysis. It is just the facts, and the facts alone are not privileged. We want to know, basically what was the perpetrator doing in your network? What kinds of, do you have malware samples? Do you have logs that you can share? Some key server images? The stuff that we need is frequently limited to technical data, and it has nothing to really do with the strengths or weaknesses on victim organization systems that led up to the breach. We're also happy to just interview people. We don't need to actually get on your computers or receive reports, but rather talk to individuals who have the technical knowledge that they can share with us so that we can come in and help identify what happened on your system and try to identify the perpetrators that did it. Sometimes it can also be us receiving redacted reports or just the business side only report. There are ways that, to compel a production, but again, we can't compel something that's protected by privilege anyway. Friendly subpoenas sometimes are requested. Those don't provide a greater level of protection than what would be afforded in a voluntary situation. And then there are statutory protections, which I'll talk about in a few slides when we get to CISA 2015. Next slide, please. So I'm also cognizant that we're running out of time. So I am going to speed through this slide. This is the obligatory FBI slide where I have to say, it is really important for you to come to us and for us to work with you, because we can investigate, gather really great intelligence, disrupt the actors, bring them to justice, share information that we learned by virtue of our investigations and by virtue of our position in the intelligence community, share that information with you in unclassified and sometimes classified formats before, during, and after breaches, help you develop black and white lists. Some cases we have decryption keys for ransomware variants. Now, obviously we don't publish these because then the malicious actors know that we have them. But if you come to us because you're affected by ransomware, there's a chance we have the key to decrypt the ransomware affecting your network. And of course, assisting victims. That is what we do, and that is what we've done long before FBI Cyber was stood up. We have a long history of doing this. We have trained victim specialists, trained agents and analysts specifically for dealing with victims, and a whole division that's dedicated to victim specialists. We provide protections, confidentiality. We share within the government specifically for investigative purposes, never for regulatory purposes. That's not our role. Victims are always the priority. And then again, statutory protections like CISA 2015. Next slide, please. So CISA 2015, I keep talking about this. Finally, here we are. The boxes and arrows on the left, they don't necessarily indicate the flow of the direction of information flow. It's more to show that it's this ecosystem where information can be shared amongst all of these actors. This was created in 2015, as the title implies. It's set to sunset in 2025. There's still discussion about what will happen at that time. Do we renew it? Do we modify it in part? Do we scrap it completely and come up with something new? If you share under this act, and in the next slide, I'll talk about how you do that, these protections on the blue boxes are available to you, all of them by sharing with the federal government. Only the last one, additional liability protection, is if you share via a specific mechanism that's detailed in the statute. Next slide, please. So what does it do? How do you get these protections? So you have to share information that is necessary to describe or identify cyber threat indicators or defensive measures. And in the next slide, I detail examples of what those are. It provides those various legal protection that I just talked about on the previous slide. And the sharing must be for a cybersecurity purpose, which means that the purpose is of protecting an information system or information that is stored on, processed by, or transiting an information system from a cybersecurity threat or security vulnerability. And it requires removal of certain personal information prior to sharing. Next slide, please. So this details what CTIs and defensive measures are, and CISA and DOJ have put out a really helpful guide. If you just Google CISA 2015, it'll probably be the first thing that pops up that really gets into detail, to explain the statute, to explain what these are, and how you can take advantage of the protections afforded by it. Next slide, please.
And I know we have about 5 minutes left and folks have access to the materials, but we can quickly zoom through these and I think finish the presentation and then leave you with some best practices. But you can go to the next slide. As we know, DOJ introduced their civil cyber fraud initiative in end of 2021. These are the 3 hooks that bring companies into the guise of potential liability under the False Claims Act that DOJ will be looking at. Just from a high level, we've talked about various and several requirements that can fall in any of those 3 buckets that are listed there. So pay attention because DOJ and so are the federal government agencies paying attention. You can move on to the next slide quickly. Here's some of the highlights of what's next. Of course, we're again continuing to see growing resource allocation, also increased coordination within the government, inspector general's offices, contracting office programs, and of course, with working with DOJ. There's a piqued interest by the relators bar, and we're seeing a lot more key TAM actions issued, and then also just an uptick in investigation, settlements, and litigation. And if you move to the next slide, this just lists some of the notable cases that we've seen. 3 of those have resulted in settlements. You have Cisco. Dell was the one case that ultimately got dismissed from a materiality and scienter perspective. And then Aerojet Rocketdyne, which of course was the big case that made headlines last year, a $9 million settlement. And then we had Comprehensive Health Services, another $930,000 settlement, which DOJ touted as the first settlement that they had received as tipping off the initiative that they have underway. You can move to the next slide. I think we have one more slide on public-private partnerships that we can briefly talk about.
Yes. So before I talk about relationships, I just want to highlight that we should be seeing the National Cybersecurity Strategy dropping soon. I can't promise what will be in the final draft, but National Cyber Director Chris Inglis has previewed that there might be a call for additional regulations in this space to encourage better cybersecurity, requiring heavy investment upfront and more public and private cooperation. So we are focusing right now on the cooperation piece of it. Again, it's very important, and we recognize that there are a lot of different organizations out there, probably too many, so it's hard to know where to put your resources and time. We're aware of that, and we're really trying to narrow down what those organizations are to make them more worth your time and resources. So stay tuned for that. And as always, continue to reach out to us and work with us. We can only be effective if you talk to us and share information so that we can connect the dots and further our investigation to bring perpetrators of cybercrime to justice, and also to help you better defend your networks and respond to a cyber incident. We're really trying hard. We've heard you say that we want more information back from the FBI. We share it a lot, but we don't get so much back. We really are trying to give more actionable information to you in a more timely way. So again, more to come.
And I think we can leave it with some best practices, leave the attendees with some thoughts. Kristen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So carrying on my theme, of course, establish a relationship with your local FBI field office. I know we say that a lot, and sometimes it's maybe a little harder to do than how it sounds. So if you don't know where to go or who to talk to, you can always reach out to me, through PubK Group, and they'll connect you directly with me. And I can find someone within your area at the local field office to work with you to establish that relationship ahead of time. And sometimes we'll even, if you want us to be involved in your tabletop exercises, to see how things will really play out when the FBI comes in, we're always happy to do that. And finally, there's opportunities that we host at Quantico and other locations across the United States for you to be involved in our CISO and General Counsel's academies, where we build those relationships and share information with you over a period of a few days. So again, reach out if you're interested, and thanks for having me.
And best practices, I'll put on the lawyer hat here, which will be a little more defensive, I guess. But I would say best practices in the area right now, really for contractors and subcontractors, is just to prepare and plan ahead. Can't emphasize enough an effective incident response plan and having that in place, because when these attacks or breaches occur, generally you have a very short time period to act. And as we've seen with some of the legal notification requirements, those timelines are pretty tight as well. Also, having your documentation secure to show that you are implementing and working towards implementing some of these security baselines is very important. As a result of the DOJ's Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, you want to make sure that you are accurately reporting and documenting your efforts in the space so that you are minimizing the risk of any sort of fraud allegations.
And then my kind of best practice, or something I'll leave you with, especially based on what we've heard today and what's been happening last year, and of course what we expect to happen this year, is just pay attention and continue to monitor the developments. You're certainly going to see a lot happening this next year. You're going to want to be on top of it. If you can't monitor yourself, certainly rely on those resources that can help you monitor those developments. And so pay attention. I think we talked about at least over 6 potential rulemakings that are, hanging out there, even more than that, maybe 9 or so. So there is a lot going on. And again, we're here to help you with that. Also, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. And thanks again for having us today.
Well, ladies, thank you very much. That was unbelievable how much you've squeezed into that. But with all those risk factors and responsibilities, I may not sleep too well tonight. So I thank you for that. Townsend, Kristen, Stacy, beautiful job. Thank you again for participating with us in our annual review. Let me again thank our event sponsors for their support. Couldn't have done this program without them. Their names are listed on the next 2 slides. Do that and the next, thank you. That concludes our sessions for today. Thanks and have a great day.